and you probably hinted on this in different ways, but in a more direct way, what would you say keeps Chicago unique from cities like Milwaukee, which in my opinion has very beautiful brick architecture?
It
Um,
does.
I love Milwaukee. What would you think separates Chicago from Milwaukee, from a Detroit, from a St. Louis? What makes us unique besides the fact, we are Chicago?
Yeah. Part of the answer is that we are Chicago.
We are Chicago. That's
Chicago.
it.
From Harold Washington to Harold's Chicken and everything in between and beyond, SoCHiology is the exploration of Chicago culture, history, legends, stories, and fiction through a myriad of discussions with Chicagoans themselves. This episode of SoCHiology is all about bricks. When I was a kid spending a lot of time at my grandma's house on the low end of Chicago in Bronzeville, I had a deep admiration for how the buildings were constructed there. I realized I had a lot of love for architecture, not enough to become an architect, but I loved admiring it from afar. That's why I'm so grateful that I found Brick of Chicago on Instagram. Brick of Chicago is a project here in the city that was founded in 2016 by Will Quam. Brick of Chicago educates us on the history of bricks, where the bricks come from, why are bricks laid and oriented in a certain way, how are bricks made, what are the different colors of bricks mean. Will is doing great work studying the science of bricks and educating people. He also gives tours in various neighborhoods of Chicago on the history of the properties there and the construction. Chicago architecture is top tier. That's not debatable. Everybody knows that. And on this episode of SoCHiology, Will is going to give us more education. He's going to give us his background on how he got involved in bricks and why he started Brick of Chicago. He's going to tell us about different types of properties and different types of architects and the styles and different periods of the city. And he's going to tell us about the future, what he thinks the future of brick construction and architecture will be as he continues to do his work and educate us all.
Like I said, we're gonna get right into it, Will. You're from Minnesota originally, right? That's where you're originally
I
from.
am. Yeah, born and raised St. Paul, Minnesota.
St. Paul,
Yeah,
Minnesota.
St. Paul, Minnesota is where I'm from.
It gets very hot up there. I was down there like last summer for the first time, and I didn't know it
Yeah,
gets hot in Minnesota. I just thought it'd be cold, like in
I
Chicago.
know, right? It's the worst of both. It's so freezing cold in the winter, and then
Mm.
just so hot and muggy in the summer.
Man, yeah, that's,
Uh,
that's when I was there in July. It was hot and muggy. I'm like, Minnesota? Like I was not expecting
yeah,
it.
nope,
You think of Minnesota, you think about the Mighty Ducks, hockey,
yeah.
cold weather. I wasn't expecting summertime up there, but yeah, very nice up there in Minnesota. So you're from St. Paul. What brought you to Chicago? You're a Chicagoan now, whether you like it or not.
Yeah,
I'm sure you accept
yeah,
it.
exactly. Oh, yeah, no, and I like it. I like it. I came here originally to be a theater teacher.
Okay.
So I moved to Chicago to teach theater. I studied theater in college and wanted to be a director and a theater teacher. And I got hired right out of college to run a middle school theater camp at Northlight Theater in Skokie. So I moved here to do that.
Okay.
And I taught theater for about 7 years. And I'd been to Chicago a bunch throughout college and growing up to come see shows because this is one of the great theater cities in the country. And so it was a place I always really liked.
Yeah.
And so it was a pretty easy decision to move here when I did.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Okay, okay. That makes a lot of sense. Like you said, Chicago's definitely one of the biggest theater cities in not only the country but the world. You know, um,
Yeah,
theater houses. Obviously the Chicago theater is the most famous one, but it's a lot of theater houses here that have been famous over the years, the past century. Balabana,
and
Cass.
that's the cool thing about Chicago theater too is you've got the big ones, the Goodman, Chicago Shakespeare, Steppenwolf, but then there's just all these small companies, people doing out of storefronts or church basements or in parks and backs of bars, and so it's a city that has so much options, so much opportunity. I also really liked that I had some peers that moved to like New York to do theater, which makes a lot of sense. But New York is so big that I feel like I saw so many people just doing theater with people they already knew.
Yeah,
Sort of in New York, I feel like it's sometimes so large, it makes you kind of insular. While Chicago, I found it was so easy to meet new people and collaborate with people in ways that I felt like everybody here has everybody else's backs and is trying to help people create opportunities, and that's carried over into this work I do now too. I think that's something that rings very true of the city as a whole.
Absolutely. So, yeah, so let's get into that. So, you're from Minnesota. You came to Chicago to explore a career in theater. At what point did the bricks invade your mind and tell you, give us some attention? Like how did this switch to the architecture and the appreciation of bricks and things like that in Chicago
Yeah.
occur?
So I've always loved architecture. I've always found it very interesting in design and things like that. So it's something I've always paid attention to.
Mhm.
And the great thing about my job is, I wasn't a theater teacher at one school. I was being sent all over the place. I was doing, 2 weeks at one school, 3 weeks at another, after school program another place. I first lived in Andersonville on the north side. My first after school class was in Beverly. Um, Basically, I guess it would have been like 13 miles straight south from where I was living.
Yeah, I was gonna
I
say
was
that's the
living
whole opposite. Yeah.
Yeah, I was living. I was that, and that was a really cool thing to see because I was living sort of off Damon in Andersonville, and the school I was teaching at after school was off Damon in Beverly, and so that was an interesting way to see. Oh wow, this city is this grid that goes forever, and you can see like Tanika Johnson's Fold a Map project is another great exploration of that. But so my job had me going all over the city, and so I got to see from that all the different neighborhoods and all the different types of design and all the different types of buildings. And, Chicago is so much of a denser, so much of a larger city than St. Paul.
Yeah.
And it's a city that was, defined by fire in 1871. And so it's a dense city made of brick because, you want good fireproof material. And I started noticing that, you have all these repetitive building types. You've got courtyard apartments, you got bungalows, you've got two flats, cottages. And the brick is what made them unique. And I like to, I would maybe arrive early at a school and I'd walk around a little bit and just notice things and then go in and you start to notice the different patterns. And if you'd asked me before any of this, what color is a brick, I would say it's red. But I started to notice, there's blue, there's pink, there's black, there's orange, and there's all these different textures. And so from there, I, just started snapping some pictures on my phone, and I texted a bunch of people, said, follow an Instagram account if I made one, please. And enough people said yes that I did. And it started small, and it was just 6 years ago, July of 2016. But I think people really were drawn to it from the beginning. Because it is a material that is so defines Chicago and is around us, and is a different way of looking at the city. You start looking at brick, you can see the whole city of Chicago differently.
Yeah, absolutely. And I've lived in Chicago my whole life. And I remember early on, I would notice certain things like certain blocks will have certain patterns, and the block next over will have an entirely different pattern, even though each block will have nothing but two flats, three flats. The patterns of them will be drastically different. That's always amazed me. Like some have bay windows, some wouldn't have bay windows.
Yeah.
So and it always made me wonder, like, was like these different architects building these different buildings, or was it the same one that just switched it up? Like that's something that always intrigued me when I used to look at the bricks of Chicago buildings and homes.
And the cool thing about Chicago is changes from year to year, decade to decade. The same is true in brick. The type of brick that is used one decade can be quite different from the type of brick used the next decade. So what neighborhood did you grow up in?
So I grew up in primarily the Bronzeville neighborhood. That's where my grandma lived. Also, I grew up a lot in the suburbs, but if we're talking about the city, it was the Bronzeville neighborhood as well as over east, which is where I'm at now in South Shore. Yeah. Yeah.
Great. Well, yeah. So yeah, Bronzeville and South Shore, there's some big differences just there. So like Bronzeville as a neighborhood was developed a lot in the Douglas section developed a lot in the late 1800s, early 20th century. Grand Boulevard developed more in the teens, and the South Shore really exploded in the 20s. So in Bronzeville, you're going to see a lot of smoother bricks. You're going to see more uniform colors. You go to South Shore and you're going to see lots of textures and lots of different colors, because by the 1920s, architects are trying to get as far away from this idea of the red brick. Like you go to Lincoln Park, you go to Pullman, you'll see all these perfectly smooth red bricks there.
Yeah, absolutely.
And that's what architects wanted in the late 1800s, was this brick that just sort of was unobtrusive and then blended into a whole wall.
Okay.
And then, architects in Bronzeville, when they were developing that neighborhood in the early 20th century, they started adding a little more texture and a little more subtle variation. They started talking about, wanting to make a brick wall look more like an autumn tree with a little bit of different tones of red, immensely decorated brick houses. And then it switches again. You can find in Bronzeville a lot, buildings from the urban renewal era, or like the campus at IIT, go back to these very sort of smooth, uniform color, often gray bricks, as architects pushed back against that. And so there were these large sort of national fashion trends that showed up in brick. And you can go to brick when neighborhoods were really developed and what architects were going for. You can find these pairs, like South Shore, you'll see a lot in common between South Shore and Uptown and Rogers Park and Garfield Park, because in the brick, because of when they were developed and what kind of architects were working there. So that to answer the question, part of it comes down to fashion.
Yeah.
Part of it comes down to, what were they trying to do? For example, like in like you go to like Brighton Park on the southwest side, that was like really developer driven, and you get these whole blocks of two flats. And what would likely happen there is one developer is building that entire block, and they're just buying a bunch of bricks, and the architect is being given free reign to, okay, just mix and match to make them individual. Don't make it all this monolithic, all brown bricks or all red bricks. Do one brown brick, one red brick, as you mix it around, to give some variation. And those are really the two big driving forces, using different kinds of bricks to make, in Chicago at least, to make otherwise uniform buildings individual, but then also trying to follow whatever the trends and whatever the fashions are.
Yeah. Oh, thank you for that education. And I'm gonna include your website in the bio of this episode, so people listening can go to your website and get all of this terminology and things like that. Because I read your site. You got different ways of how you lay the brick, right? You got what's it called, soldier. Different ways.
You call a brick a different name based on how it's oriented in the wall. I have a brick collection of about 65 bricks, but I don't have any in my office right now. But I do have a Lego brick, so I can use a Lego brick.
Okay.
So you have stretcher, which is the long way, probably the way you most recognize it. Header, which is the short face.
Okay.
You turn the short face up tall, it comes a rowlock. Turn the whole brick up skinny like that, it comes a soldier. Sailor when it's broad, and turn it on its side with the broad face, it's a shiner. So all these different ways to interlock them and make designs in the wall.
Yeah. And so my family, we have a 2-flat here in South Shore, and I was looking at the bricks. I'm like, okay, how is my 2-flat oriented? And I think it's a lot. It's a lot of sailors in there. It's just like they just put them on top of each other, and that makes up the majority of the facade of our 2-flat here. But right across the gangway, or the pathway, whatever you want to call it, politically correct, is another 2-flat, and I'm looking at it right now out the window of my home office, and I see the Chicago brick that you mentioned. The Chicago brick makes up the sides and the backs of these buildings, not just 2-flats, but many buildings in Chicago. Can you give us some enlightenment on what Chicago brick is?
Yeah, exactly. So Chicago Common Brick was the brick made locally here in Chicago. So the distinction is Chicago Common Brick, made here in Chicago. And on the front of buildings, you have what's called face brick. And face brick almost universally was brought in from outside of Chicago. The brick that you'll see on the front of almost every single building in Chicago came from outside of the city, from Pennsylvania, from Ohio, from Ottawa, Illinois, but not from Chicago. The reason is because that Chicago brick, the stuff made here, was considered some of the ugliest brick in the country, even by Chicago architects, because it's the clay that was used to make this brick came from glaciers 14,000 years ago, and those glaciers just mixed a whole bunch of stuff in this clay when they were deposited on the ground. And so when they would pack this clay into molds and fire it, some bricks would be yellow, some would be pink, some would be red, some would be, almost pale, some would be, have sort of black sooty marks on them. And it was not consistent at all. That's not what architects liked. But it was local and it was really, really stupid cheap. It was about $5 to buy 1,000 of these common bricks. So they still used a bunch of them, but they tucked them away on the sides and the backs of the building and then paid $50 to buy 1,000 of the nice bricks on the front. And so they really hid them away. So the Chicago common bricks were valuable in that they were cheap, they were good, they did the job as well as any other brick, fireproof, but because they were considered ugly, they weren't put on the fronts of buildings. Not until the 20s through the 60s when some architects started to appreciate that. But that's part of what makes Chicago such an interesting brick city, is that we have all this homegrown brick that we hid away. And because we didn't want to use that homegrown brick, we sourced everything else from everywhere else, which meant Chicago architects really responded to changes in fashion. Red brick is out, stop importing it from St. Louis, start importing textured brick from Ohio. It wasn't like, well, we should continue using what we have here, because they didn't want to use what they had here for the fronts of buildings.
And they had a lot of bricks here, not to cut you off, but they had a lot of bricks here, right? Like, wasn't Chicago like the hub of bricks for like the country or the world at one point? Something like that?
Kind of, yeah. Yeah, Chicago produced more bricks and cheaper bricks than anywhere else in the country by probably about 1915. So Chicago produced by the 19-teens, about 1.5 billion bricks a year.
Wow.
A lot of more than even Hudson Valley in upstate New York that produced for New York City. And by 1915, they still only cost about $12 to buy 1,000 of them. And so they were cheaper than anywhere. And what that meant was it was often cheaper to import Chicago common brick into your town than it was to fire your own bricks. And so you'll find Chicago common bricks in the South from the early 20th century, because it could be easier just to import a couple carloads of that common brick than to try to start making your own bricks there, because it's just so cheap, even bringing it in. And part of what made it so cheap was because it was, like I said, this clay deposit by glaciers, and it was right at the surface. It was right at the surface. A lot of that nicer brick, that you have to dig a little harder to find the right kind of clay. The common brick clay was right at the surface, and especially right by the river. And so you had all these brick plants on the south branch and on the north branch of the river that were just pumping out bricks, by the millions year after year, and really putting everybody else to shame with our production. So yeah, Chicago to me is the great brick city of America. The only one that can really possibly rival it is New York City, but everywhere else comes second.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and even when it came to New York, like you said, we still was producing more. And maybe I'm biased, but I believe the architecture here is better than New York anyway. I
agree. We've got it's Chicago. We've got a lot of what I love about Chicago architecture is that because it's a city of neighborhoods, 77 official neighborhoods and way more unofficial neighborhoods. You get way more. You get these hyper-specific architectural styles. One of the things I give a tour of McKinley Park, and you'll find along the southwest side this type of what my friend Erica lovingly calls a bungaloid, which is like, it looks like you take a bungalow and then just kind of add another story below it. So it's like a 2-flat with a bungalow sitting on top of it. And for some reason, you only really get that type of 2-flat in McKinley Park, Brighton Park, Little Village, Lawndale, Cicero, Berwyn, those areas. You don't see it anywhere else in the city. And it's just sort of hyper-located to those areas. And then within each area, you get, who were the people who were driving the construction. And so you get these hyper-specific, like think Beverly, where I first taught. You get a lot of these, brick cottages in these sort of whimsical styles from these wealthier Chicagoans who wanted to build houses that looked like little European cottages. And, the kind of way that you don't really see anywhere else in Chicago. But the type of brick they're using is also being used in other parts of the city. So you can create connections that way, but they each still have their own individuality.
That's an interesting connection there because okay, you say like the neighborhoods were hyper specific, right? So like we talked about a couple minutes ago, when I was a kid, I spent a lot of my time in the Bronzeville area and in the South Shore area. That's where I spent a lot of my time. But I also spent a lot of time living in the suburbs in Markham. Okay. Now in Markham, those type of suburbs, you don't really see that type of Chicago style architecture, that Chicago common brick. But if you go a little bit north to other suburbs like Blue Island, for example, like Blue Island to be, at least in the south suburbs, has a lot of Chicago flair to it. You know, you will see the bungalows out there in Blue Island. You will see the twoplex out there in Blue Island. Do you think that's because it's the proximity to the city? The like, why do you think that is, in your opinion?
Yeah, I think it's twofold. One is that Blue Island was a site of Chicago common brick production for probably about 70 years. One of the last common brick manufacturers had their plant in Blue Island. So a lot of common brick was made in Blue Island. But it's also, you know, these first ring suburbs. You had a lot of Chicagoans who lived there, a lot of people who moved out of Chicago to live there and still were living there with that connection to the city. While you go a little further out, especially you know in the early 20th century, when these towns were being developed, there's not that same connection. There's not that same connection to the city, and there's not, you know, they don't need to build to Chicago's building code, which after 1874 required fireproof construction, and so it was cheaper not to. So I think those are probably the two big reasons: trying to be more like Chicago because it's populated mostly by Chicagoans or former Chicagoans, and still being a big part of that brick manufacturing.
I didn't know Blue Island had a Chicago brick manufacturer out there. I never knew that, but it kind of makes sense now that you say it, you know, because once you look at the different type of buildings that's out there, the layout, you know, it gives you very industrial vibes, you know, kind of sort of like the Port of,
Yeah,
you know, so it makes sense. I never knew that
for
though.
sure.
Yeah, I never knew.
Yeah, it was the so Chicago Common Brick. By 1970, there were only two producers left. One, the Illinois Brick Company in Blue Island, and one, the American Brick Company in Dalton. And the Illinois Brick Company in Blue Island had been operating there since maybe the teens or the 20s, maybe even from before, and a huge, massive operation there. And yeah, and then it was in operation until 1970, and then that shut down there. And the other one in Dalton kept going until about 1980. But yeah, because the Chicago Common clays were right at the surface, basically they would mine the clay, and then when they ran out of that really easy to get to clay, they would sort of just shut down that pit and move a little further out. And so by the late mid 20th century, most of the common brick manufacturing was happening outside of the city itself, within Cook County, but outside of the city itself, because that's where the more easily accessible clay was. My favorite example of a clay pit that was filled in, and what happened to a lot of clay pits is, you know, they would harvest the clay and they get this big hole in the ground, and it would just become an official or unofficial dump. And all over the city, you have these reports of these people just dumping tons of crap in the clay pits, and neighbors going up in arms and hating that this is happening, and then it getting redeveloped. So my favorite example is there was three large pits at Addison and Western Avenue by three different companies in the late 1800s. And then in the early 20th century, the Illinois Brick Company, compared to like the Google of its day, bought all three of them, made it their one big plant. By 1916, it was empty, became a dump. And in 1928, the city paved over it, and they built Lane Tech High School on top of it.
Wow. Lane Tech is on top of a old
Yeah.
pit. Interesting.
Yeah, Lane Tech was on top of an old brick plant. Yeah,
and that's probably why Lane Tech is so big, because they had to make it big to cover all of that area. I would assume.
Like, well, they made it big too, because they were actually it was going to be 3 times as large. I've read, because it was they just had there was something like at one point there were like 9,000 students at Lane Tech at one point.
Yeah,
which is all boys, which was insane. But yeah, it was Lane Tech. It was Riverview Amusement Park was on that same land there. At Narragansett, you have the Brickyard Mall. That was a clay pit that was filled in the 70s, 60s or 70s, I think, to make a mall. Horner Park in Ravenswood, Albany Park. That's a former brick pit. So
Wow.
you have them all, they were all over the city. And you mostly never know anymore now.
Yeah. I wouldn't have known if you ain't tell me that. Like I would have never guessed that. It's interesting you mentioned Lane Tech High School. I want to touch on this real quick as well. So, first of all, let me just say I appreciate the architecture of Chicago. I appreciate the brick. I'm an old school type of soul. I'm an old soul. I like how things used to be back in the day because it's beautiful. I feel like architecture isn't taken as serious anymore. That's just my personal opinion. So a lot of these houses, so like I said, I'm over here on the block away from me. It was an empty lot, and the entire block is two flats. But on this empty lot, they built two new two flats, but obviously with newer material, they're not as attractive to me. Okay.
Yeah.
I say that just to say I see the same thing happening with schools. I feel like Chicago has some of the most beautiful schools that have ever been constructed. Even elementary schools. These elementary schools that was built in the early 1900s are huge, but they were beautifully designed. Like the brick lane, the architecture of all that. But now you got these new schools popping up, and it's just what's the correlation with the brick and Chicago public schools? Obviously, brick was being used to build all types of buildings, but what's some history with that? As far as like the school systems go.
For sure. Well, so the Chicago public school system used to build on what they call the 100-year model. These buildings that were meant to last at least 100 years, and it's a big, proud institution. In terms of design, they were building a lot of these classically inspired buildings meant to look like Greek or Roman temples, or Gothic inspired buildings meant to look like cathedrals. And so the masonry is a huge part of that, using brick and stone and terracotta. At the time those were being built, there was one of the most abundant resources in Chicago was labor. There were so many people available and knowledgeable to do the work, and cheaply, to do that work really cheaply. And so it was easy to make this huge masonry building with a lot of craft because the labor was there and available. You also had things like, some school board members owned brick companies and were feeding their materials in there. Dwight Perkins, great architect of the Chicago public school system, he designed Schurz High School, he designed Harper High School, a lot of the best schools. He got fired because he didn't want to use bricks from this board member. But what happens is, fashion changes. In the 20s, it was all about these revival styles, Tudor revival, Gothic revival, classical revival. We get into the Great Depression, the money dries up, and the fashion changes to this more international modern style, which is where you get a lot of the buildings from the 30s, like DuSable High School. Is a beautiful brick school, but it's much, much simpler than you look at like Lane Tech, which is ironic because they were built at the same time, but you have to look at the racist policies of the school board at the time. You could see where they allocated the decorative funds. And then you get into the 50s and 60s, and it becomes much more about steel and about glass. And brick is not so much the thing anymore. Now it becomes these open, bright, sanitary buildings that it's all about having as much windows and as much light as possible. And so it's tricky. The 20s is an era that Chicago grew a tremendous amount. And it's also an era that was one of the most expressive eras of brick architecture ever, or in the world, because of the type of brick people were using and the cheapness of labor. By the time you get to the 60s and 70s through now, labor is now really expensive. Labor is one of the more expensive parts of the puzzle. And so to have those more intense decorative elements is more expensive and harder to do. So you get a lot of new school buildings built in the 90s and early 2000s that are really only okay. You know, I love studying the schools. So you get like there's a new blueprint made in like '98 by DeStefano Partners, the firm, built all over the city. Finkel Elementary at Western 22nd was the first one. I think it's Cesar Chavez Elementary Pilsen's another example. McFadden in Austin. The last school I taught at before I pivoted to this full time, New Sullivan High School or Elementary School in South Chicago. The same. It's just a big box, and it doesn't have really any texture on it. An interesting thing they did is the architects could add whatever brick patterns they wanted to it. So you get some like McFadden has these diamonds in it, but it's not that interesting. What you get though is I think the school board actually is putting more, and the Public Buildings Commission is putting more emphasis on doing interesting things with the school buildings. So like you get the brand new Englewood STEM High School.
Yeah.
It's a huge modern building. It's certainly not doing all the Gothic classical things that, Lane Tech did, but it's using this, it has this sort of grid of orange and white bricks to create this lively pattern across the facade, this sort of intensely geometric design in a really lively, interesting way. Or a lot of the new additions that are being built onto elementary schools or high schools in Chicago are doing really interesting things with brick, like Taft High School just built a new freshman academy that is really, really cool brick building. Or one of my favorites that I photographed recently is, I wonder, I share my screen. I can show you a picture of it.
Okay.
An addition, looks like you have to allow me to.
Let's see.
Or I could pull it up on my phone and hold it up the camera.
Yeah, let's do that because I'm not sure why it's not allowing you. It should do it automatically because I did this on
no problem.
Yeah.
But you get so Ebinger Elementary, it's a new or it's an elementary school addition designed by Studio ARQ. And it's got, I don't know if you can see this sort of sunburst pattern
I see
in the bricks around the window.
I see. And that's on your page. So
which I think is,
yeah.
Yeah, exactly. I posted that just the other day.
Okay.
And there's other that are using weird textured bricks and everything.
Yeah.
And so there are more interesting things happening. But which is the very long answer to your question. There are some more interesting things happening, but it's tricky because a lot of times clients are more conservative and afraid to fund these things, and then the labor is expensive. The labor and the materials are expensive.
Yeah.
But we've had in the recent past, I've seen, especially among schools, a lot more interesting things starting to happen.
Yeah, and that's definitely one thing that I've caught an interest in within the past couple years is the schools. Again, it's something that you see it your whole life, but you don't never really start thinking about it until something clicks in your mind. And I'm like, man, these schools are just amazing. And we all know the story about how like 50 plus schools, CPS schools, was closed 2012, 2013. And a lot of these schools are still sitting vacant, especially on the south and west sides of Chicago. Like it's one in Roseland that I saw recently. Alfred Cohn, I believe is the name of it. It was an elementary school off State Street, and it's huge, and it's just sitting, and it's just like this beauty is sitting there, and it's just like I would hate for that thing to be erased. Like it has to be purpose some way somehow because like they built a newer model of it, but again, like you said, the labor, the taste, and all of that, and it's a clearly smaller school. Well, let me just be candid. The school itself is closed down, period. But they did build a newer one, I'm sure, like within the past 15 years that was smaller, more modern, but it's ugly in my opinion. Like it's hideous. Like it has nothing on the old model that was built over a century ago. And I'm like, man, like these things need to be preserved by all costs, like for real.
And with what I call Rahm's great purge of the school closings, the great thing about these buildings is they're built to last. And so they can be reused. They can be reused. And they should be reused because both for community purposes, they were these hubs of community, let them continue to be hubs in a different way, but for environmental purposes too. They've all this material there, and it would cost so much money, so much energy, so much carbon to tear that down and build something new. When in reality, these were built to last, and if you maintain them well, they can continue to last for as long as you need it to. It's interesting. I interviewed an architect named Carol Ross Barney, who has designed a lot of schools. She did Little Village Academy, and I said Cesar Chavez earlier. She designed Cesar Chavez at the same time as these other ones I mentioned that were just kind of these big boxes were being built. And these two schools that she built used glazed brick. She told me she tried to think of the brick as a painting material on these schools, and they're really interesting and really dynamic and really beautiful. And they cost about the same to build as this other model. But she told me that the mayor, Daley, he said, well, we're going to go with this other model because it's more fair. Everybody gets the same thing. Everybody gets the exact same thing, as opposed to sort of having these more custom designed buildings that fit the needs of the community and fit the design of the community. The Little Village Academy takes a lot of inspiration from, Latin American architecture because of where it is and the community it's serving. But he said, nope, we're going to give everybody the same thing. And so nobody can be mad at me. But you look at the older Chicago school models, a lot of those, there are repeats. They would make a model and they would copy it, but a lot of them were still designed to fit within communities, especially like Park Field Houses. That's a great example. Park Field Houses really were designed to fit the community. Pulaski Park Field House in Noble Square at Black Hawk and Evergreen, I think, or Black Hawk, and it's just north of the Polish Triangle, is built to look like a Polish village hall because of the community that it was built to be a part of. And we lost some of that, but we can get some of that back. And we are. As long as the people are using these materials and doing these things intentionally.
Yeah, and like in Chicago, you say every neighborhood has its own identity. That's the beautiful thing about Chicago. Like like we talked about earlier in the episode, each neighborhood has its own distinction when it comes to the properties there. But not only each neighborhood, each block might have its own distinction, right? We have 2 flats, 3 flats. We have the 4 flats. We have the mixed use properties on the main streets. We have the bungalows, the bungalow belt. Very popular here in Chicago. What?
Well, and you go to what I love about the bungalow belt too is you go to Portage Park, you go to Gage Park, you go to Auburn Gresham, you're going to see some of the same things, but you're also going to see a lot of things that are distinctive to those communities because they were working within the same templates, but they were isolated from each other and doing their own individual things. And so I don't know, that's just what I love about this city. And that, every neighborhood has multiple generations of this history. No neighborhood has remained unchanged throughout its whole history. There's all these different multiple generations, and the buildings tell each of those generations of stories.
Yeah. And let me ask you this. So, Chicago, obviously, you mentioned it. A lot of the bricks for a lot of these buildings were imported from other cities, Pennsylvania, Ohio, St. Louis. So obviously Chicago isn't the only brick city in America. We get that. But what would you say, and you probably hinted on this in different ways, but in a more direct way, what would you say keeps Chicago unique from cities like Milwaukee, which in my opinion has very beautiful brick architecture?
It does.
I love Milwaukee. What would you think separates Chicago from Milwaukee, from a Detroit, from a St. Louis? What makes us unique besides the fact, we are Chicago?
Yeah. Part of the answer is that we are Chicago.
We are Chicago.
Chicago is a city that has the perfect combination of density, of design intent, and of history to make all of these things happen. It's a city that burned down in 1871 because it was made out of wood, and then rebuilt out of brick and rebuilt at an unbelievable rate and an unbelievable scale. Like when I go back to St. Paul or when I go visit my brother in Pittsburgh, I'll see a lot of the similar things I will see here in Chicago, but the scale is so much smaller. I'll see a 2-story apartment building in St. Paul. It's an amazing architecture city because they're using mostly local bricks there, you don't get the same variety we have here in Chicago. And so I think it's about Chicago's, the events that occurred in Chicago, the scale at which this city built, rivaled only by New York City in the era that we built, and the passion we have here for design and for chronicling and telling history make this city so unique in terms of our brick architecture, but just our architecture in general.
Yeah.
This is a city that really cares about architecture and cares about telling people, giving that information away.
Yeah. We're talking about bricks, but just as a quick point, how do you, because, not only in a lot of these neighborhoods where you see brick, you will see a lot of stone. Harlem isn't the only place. New York isn't the only place with the gray stones, the brick stones, and things like that. What do you think was the thought process in like, okay, we're gonna make this building brick, but we're gonna make this building stone? What was the thought process? Like, in your opinion, based off your research, your knowledge, because again, Bronzeville, you will see a myriad of different properties like that. You will see some brick, a lot of brick.
Yeah.
But you're going to see a lot of stone. You're going to see a lot of gray stone. You're going to see some red stone up in there. Was it cost?
Yeah.
Was it, like you said, the taste? What was it that went into those decisions in your imagination?
Yeah. In the late 1800s, early 20th century, it was a matter of cost and wealth. If you were wealthy, you did the gray stone.
Okay.
Because it was a more expensive material. It was a material that could be carved into these ornate designs, and by having those ornate designs, you're showing off, I spent a lot of money on this place. And so you will, on Michigan Avenue in Bronzeville, you'll get those rows of gray stones. And same thing like in North Lawndale, you get those rows of gray stones.
I was gonna say that, yeah.
From these wealthier Chicagoans. That's why churches are often these big gray stones. That gray stone is a Bedford, Indiana limestone, and you also see so much because it's really easy to work with, and it really resists water really well. Now, if you're really rich, you might bring in stone from outside. You might bring in that brown stone that they use in New York City. Or like in the case of the Swift Mansion at 45th in Michigan, you're bringing in a Georgia white marble.
Yeah, that thing is huge.
It's huge. And you don't see that stone anywhere in Chicago. So that is their way of showing we got lots of money and we're putting it here. Then in like the 30s with the Art Deco movement, you start to see that stone being used because it's modern. The big smooth blocks of stone. You think of like the Palmolive building or the Drake Hotel. They use that stone because it can kind of make it this big, smooth, monolithic thing. And that's sort of where that shift comes. But stone has generally been used because it's more expensive and it's a way to kind of just demonstrate wealth.
Okay.
And some of these, so I've been researching, what were the pre-fire buildings in Chicago like? And Chicago's first architect wrote in the 1880s that part of the reason why Chicago's architecture was so bad in the 1830s is because we didn't have any stone. We couldn't have beautiful buildings because we didn't have stone buildings. And it wasn't until the 1850s when Chicago started importing stone from Joliet that our buildings could finally get beautiful. So I think that's very telling as well. And a lot of the brick they used was to try to make it look like stone rather than look like brick.
So Joliet was a huge importer as well, right down the street.
Yeah, exactly. And that it's a different kind of stone, not the gray stone. It's sort of a creamy yellow stone. It's the stone you'll find on the water tower downtown, the old water tower. And you'll see it on older buildings in like Pilsen, Bucktown, Wicker Park areas like that. Okay. It doesn't hold up as well to carving or to water, and so the gray stone really took over from it.
So you've been doing this, like you said, since 2016. You've been studying brick, teaching about brick since 2016. What does the future look like? Well, this is a twofold question. First, let me
Yeah.
ask you, what is the central joy that you get from studying brick? And then after that, what does the future look like for you as you continue to educate Chicago, but also the country on architecture and the art of brick and all of those things?
Yeah. So that's the first part. What is my joy in researching this? I consider my job to be, both when I was teaching theater and when I'm doing this, it's my job to be professionally excited. So I get excited when I learn something, thinking about how am I going to give this away? How am I going to communicate this to people? This is such a cool new way to view this city or this building or this material. And I cannot wait to tell everyone I possibly can about this and find a way to give it away to them in a way that they're going to really like it. And I like that challenge. I like to say I spent 10 years trying to get middle schoolers to be honest about their emotions as a theater teacher. And so now I get to try to get people excited about one of the world's most boring materials, as is what they think, at least. Mm-hmm. So I really like finding new ways of seeing things and then figuring out how am I going to give that away. What do I think the future of brick is? I think we're going to see a lot of brick being used in pretty boring ways. There's you get new condo buildings, you get new grocery stores, you get new block-sized apartments going up. A lot of the time, architects and developers are just putting brick on because they're saying, hey, this is a brick. You know what it is. I fit in the city. But the brick isn't doing anything interesting. But we sort of have this gift where brick is no longer being used as the structural material in buildings. Concrete, steel, lumber is being used for that. Brick is just the skin. Because it's just the skin, some architects are treating it much more like an expressive material, like on that school with the sunburst pattern, or you get buildings that have the bricks projecting out or having these voids where you can see through the walls. Because the brick only needs to be decorative, some architects are choosing to make it really interesting. And so I think we're going to start to see more of that. I don't think that's going to become the predominant thing, but I think we're going to start to see more of that. I hope we see more and more of that. And I hope I encourage, my work encourages architects, designers, developers, homeowners to put that little bit more of thought, a little bit more of effort into the design of these things. But I also hope through my work that I encourage people to go out and see this city. I like to end all of my tours by saying that brick is the thing that I have chosen to obsess about, but that everything in the world is built or created in some way. And if you pick any one thing, you can just dive down in a rabbit hole and use that as a lens to view the city. And Chicago is a city that you will never run out of things to explore. And so I hope people use my work to pick a neighborhood or a block they've never been to and drop in on the most things that you can observe and appreciate, or that you can see that unlock some secrets of how the building works. And so I hope people get out there and do that through my work.
And you are doing the work, Will. You inspire me. Like I said, I've always had the inkling and the seed to want to really dive into studying the brick because I always appreciate the architecture. But then I found your resource and I'm like, man, I never knew what a soldier or a sailor was. I never knew that. I just thought they was laying down the bricks because it was easy that way. But it's a science to everything. I think people really need to understand everything. Nothing on this earth is just by happenstance. Everything is a science, and you are basically scientists of bricks. You study the bricks, you study the background of bricks, the history of bricks, the future of bricks. So your work, tell us about your work, so people can know about it. I would definitely include the information in the episode link as well. But your tours, what is the next one? Things like that.
Yeah, so my website is brickofchicago.com. I'm also on Instagram at brickofchicago. I post every day different brick buildings from all over the city and sometimes from out of town. I do travel and take pictures of bricks from wherever I go. I give tours in 7 different neighborhoods in Logan Square, Old Town, Rogers Park, Noble Square, Hyde Park, Bronzeville, McKinley Park. I do that from about April through November. This weekend is my last weekend of the season, but I'll be back in April with two. I'm going to add 2 new neighborhoods and sort of sunset 2 others. I'm still figuring out right now what I want to add on. South Shore is one I'm considering because that is one of the great brick neighborhoods in this city. And the tours with the tours, I like to say that brick is just the beginning on those. I start from this place of, you're going to see the city in a new way through brick, but you're also going to learn about the design of the building. I've done research on who lived in these buildings, both the people who built the buildings, but also who came after. For example, my Old Town tour, we see a workers' cottage, which is a very popular style of building after the fire. The guy who built it was basically an artisanal woodworker. But in 1941, there was a woman living in there who ran a legal pet shop out of the place with just houses full of cats and dogs. Wow. And now it's owned by a guy who keeps chickens and ducks in the front yard.
That's great.
So it's all these different stories. Or, looking in Old Town, a neighborhood people don't talk about how urban renewal was used in Old Town and used to exclude people as from the invention of this new neighborhood. We go through and we see how can you read the landscape here and see what happened here, and then look at how that has, what has caused from that. So those are my tours. And you can find out stuff about those at brickofchicago.com. I'm also writing a book now on the history of brick architecture in Chicago. So I'm going even more in depth in this research, and that's going to be published by the University of Chicago Press, hopefully 2024. We'll see what happens. I got about 68,000 words left to write.
Not too much.
yeah. No, nothing.
Yeah, nothing major. But yeah, man, I definitely, thank you for taking this time out to talk with me. You definitely piqued my interest even more. Like, I wish I could just ask you questions all day because I would. I'm very inquisitive. Because it's.
Well, let's meet up in South Shore and walk around and look at bricks.
Yeah, we could definitely do that. I'm down to do that. And unfortunately, since this is your last tour, I won't be able to make that. But I do plan on making your tours once they start up again in April. Because I definitely want to get involved and, just learn more and, bring others into it as well. Because like you said, bricks are everywhere, man. Like, we used to have streets made out of bricks, and people don't even know that. People don't even know that. Like, we used to have streets made out of bricks,
Yeah. And before that, they were made out of granite. And before that, they were made out of wood.
Wood streets. Can you imagine? I can't imagine a wood. Like,
They soaked the wood in creosote, and it burned really easily, and so it didn't last very long.
Wow, yeah, that sounds very dangerous. But it's just it's just very amazing to see the different ways of bricks and how they're used and things like that. And so you are definitely doing great things. Definitely keep it up. Don't stop. I can see this going bigger than it already is. Have you ever thought about expanding to other cities, studying the brick in other cities, or are you just going to stay exclusive to Chicago?
That's a great question. I always sort of have to grapple with, how do I grow this and change this? Because I never meant this to become my job.
You're going to be a theater director.
I know this is sort of, I'm building the airplane as I fly. So I try to keep every option open. And so it's possible somewhere down the line. Yeah. I'll have other cities offered, but we'll see.
We'll see.
Don't forget to follow Will on Instagram at Brick of Chicago. Also, go to his website, brickofchicago.com, to learn more information about his future tours in 2023 and beyond, as well as other information and education on bricks, all types of bricks, white bricks, red bricks, blue bricks, lime bricks, you name it, bricks. If you enjoyed this podcast, whatever platform you're listening to it on right now, whether it be Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, etc., leave a 5-star review and a comment. Let us know what you think. And don't forget to subscribe to our sister podcast, Mogul Motivation, from True Stories Media.